Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Reason Through podcast, a show dedicated to having charitable, philosophical discussions, as well as helping you, the listener, develop and reason through your view. In this episode, Dr. Jason Rogers and I finish our conversation on epistemology. We speak about foundationalism and coherentism. These are theories of knowledge that are internalistic. If you find value in what I'm doing, please consider subscribing, rating, reviewing the podcast as it shows your support, and I would greatly appreciate it. And without further ado, I bring you Dr. Jason Rogers. We've said quite a bit on kind of externalist epistemology. We can move to some type of internalist epistemology, which is kind of known as foundationalism and coherentism. And this doesn't rely on anything external. This is about what's going on internally within the mind of a person.
Yeah. Now, an externalist could be a foundationalist too, or a coherentist. I don't know that I know of any externalist coherentists offhand, but when we talk about those views, I'll make that clear. But yeah, so um, leaving aside the externalist views, there are also these internalist views. They're kind of more, you might say, and again, this will be controversial with some people, but more traditional views. So the view that something like so one internalist view is a view known as evidentialism, and the people you mentioned, Feldman and Connie, are two evidentialists, probably most well known evidentialists, and they defend the view that essentially beliefs being justified for a person is a matter of that person's believing on the basis of good evidence, good reasons. That's what it is to be justified. It's to have good reasons. Um, and like I said, that's kind of, you might think, the traditional view. In the Gettier cases we discussed, for example, when we were trying to build it up that the person has a justified true belief, we were saying, well, he gets lots of evidence about those things. He sees that Jones is driving a Ford or has Ford keys and so forth. So it's kind of a natural view. At one point somewhere, Rich and Connie and Feldman, I think they sort of express like amazement that that people still don't see that it's obvious or clearly true or something like that. But it is an internalist view because it requires, when it says that justification is a matter of evidence that you have, what it means for you to have evidence on these views is to like be aware of some supporting reason. So it's not having evidence like at a crime scene, right? Like possessing a knife in your physical location. It's not that kind of evidence. They mean like being aware of reasons supporting a belief. It's called internalist roughly because the uh, the things that make the belief justified are internal, within your awareness or within your mind. Um, so there are different ways of characterizing it, but that's the rough idea. People object to that view still too, for various different reasons. I mentioned like my son believing things about the world around him. I suppose someone could say he doesn't have good enough evidence for those beliefs or something like that. He just hasn't
Or that
thought
he
it
hasn't
through.
really internalized it to where, right? Because most people, I would say, most people kind of already just, I guess, for lack of a better word, believe that there's an external world without ever questioning that an external world exists.
Yeah, right.
That could, in fact, be a brain in a vat.
Mhm.
Um, and so, or the
Yeah,
nature.
so
And so, yeah, that's kind of like, is internalism requiring something too strong? Do we
right.
need to always be aware of the reasons for why we
Yeah,
believe
yeah.
um, some proposition?
Yeah, right. So some people have objected or would object to evidentialism on the basis that like it leads to these skeptical concerns, or like you can't really be justified in believing anything or something on the basis of just your evidence because you could be wrong or something like that. So that's one way that people might object to evidentialism. um, Now, when we talk about having evidence for a belief, and relating this to the things you mentioned, foundationalism and coherentism, basically, foundationalism and coherentism you could think of them as views about what the structure of your reasons needs to look like. So you could be an evidentialist and a foundationalist, Okay, so you could think a foundationalist thinks roughly that um, beliefs that are justified ultimately have some foundation, right? And if it's a foundation because it's a thing that doesn't need further justification. Um, so there are different views about what the foundations are, but the basic idea is you kind of have these, you have beliefs like, I don't know, I believe that there's a computer in front of me right now. That's based on something. Uh, Maybe there are different views here. It's based on uh, my belief that it looks like there's a computer here in front of me, or and maybe that belief is based on some awareness of my own experiences or something like that, and then it sort of stops there. Right? That belief, it does. There's no further justification required once I get to the fact that I'm having this experience that I'm having.
So pretty much what you're highlighting is like, so kind of classical foundationalism is something like my belief in C is based off of my belief in B, and my belief in B is based off of my belief in A, and A is kind of the bedrock of that. That's the foundation of where all my other beliefs kind of are justified from.
Yeah, it's a little hard to talk about it very quickly because there are just so many different possible views here, and ones that have been taken. But yeah, you mentioned classical foundationalism, so that's kind of a view that, at least at times, is associated with early modern philosophers like Descartes or John Locke, perhaps. Uh, and there are still defenders of it today. Timothy McGrew is one. Richard Fumerton is another. Um, those views tend to be more strict in some way. So they think something like, um, your external world beliefs, for example, might be based on um, something else that you're. Let's take Fumerton's view, for example. Fumerton thinks you need, at the foundational level, your foundational beliefs are justified by being directly acquainted with certain things. Directly acquainted just means, well, it's hard to say what it means. He doesn't give an analysis. It's something that you just know what it means. But so the things he thinks you're directly acquainted with are not things like computers and tables and chairs and things like that, but things like maybe your experience that you're having right now. Um, and so the thought there in classical foundationalism is that somehow these beliefs that you have about the external world are themselves based on other beliefs, beliefs typically about your experiences or things like that, and you somehow have to um, support the external world beliefs from other beliefs, presumably by some kind of inference, um, inference to the best explanation or something like that.
So
Um,
kind of something for, I guess, our listeners to really think about kind of foundationalism is that like when you build a house, right, you have a foundation of the house, and
mhm,
that's kind of what is your all your other beliefs are resting upon is this kind of sort of foundation.
that's
Uh,
right.
that's kind of a very very easy way to kind of think about foundationalism or classical
Mhm.
foundationalism is that there's this resting kind of thing that all your other beliefs are resting on.
Yeah, and classical foundationalism and foundationalism aren't equivalent. They're not the same thing. You could be a classical foundationalist. You can also be what's called sometimes a moderate foundationalist or uh, modest foundationalist. The classical foundationalists, like Descartes, for example, he thought he had to build up justification for his belief that there are real world objects around him from beliefs about his sensory experience by some kind of argument. The argument involved various steps, but his he didn't think, for example, that like your belief that there's a computer in front of you is justified just on the basis of your current experience. There was more to it than that. You needed to infer it from some other more basic beliefs, more foundational beliefs. Modest foundationalists tend to think, actually, the foundational beliefs are the ones about the external world. Um, they are based on uh, experiences directly. So the experience you're having right now directly justifies you in believing that there's a computer in front of you. Um, you had Mike Humer on your show. His view is a modest or moderate foundationalist view. So if it seems to you that there's a computer in front of you and
Hmm.
you don't have any defeating reason for believing that, and so forth, then you're justified in believing there's a computer in front of you. There's nothing further beyond below the seeming. The seeming is just the thing that is the basis for your belief. Um, that's a kind of foundationalist view too. Uh, and now, opposed to foundationalism is coherentism. This will probably be the last thing I talk about, I think, and then we've covered a lot. Like we did sort of a whirlwind tour of epistemology just to give people basic ideas about what the views out there are.
Mm-hmm.
So a coherentist, uh, you might sort of motivate the view by thinking about sort of modest foundationalism, at least of a sort. Uh, so coherentists can come in different varieties too. So this is why it's always tough to talk about any of these things. But so suppose an external world, a modest foundationalist said, you're looking at a tree. Okay, it's an oak tree or something like that, and you're justified on the basis of your experience in believing that there's an oak tree in front of you. Okay, well, you might start to think, well, that's an interesting case, right? Because imagine if I don't know, a 2-year-old was put in front of that tree. Okay, would they be justified in believing that's an oak tree? They probably don't know what an oak tree is. They might know what a tree is. Maybe they're justified in believing it's a tree. Okay, but then what's going on there? It looks like maybe the belief that that's an oak tree was not really foundational at all. Maybe some background beliefs were playing a role. So the person we considered who knew that it was an oak tree or was justified in believing that it's an oak tree might have had various other beliefs, like oak trees grow in this area, they have leaves that look like this, et cetera, et cetera. The reason I'm pointing this out is because a coherentist is kind of going to exploit things like that and say, well, look, see, all these other beliefs are involved in what you thought was a foundational belief. And really, the coherentist thinks justification is sort of always like that. It's a holistic matter about a variety of beliefs in your system of beliefs. It's not that the experience directly justifies you or something like that. Instead, when your beliefs all cohere or something like that, and you add another belief to it, if there's positive coherence there, if the coherence value goes up or something like that, or at least stays the same, that belief is justified for you. So you use the metaphor of a house. Sometimes people use a metaphor of a raft for coherentism. A raft, it's built with, like if you think of like logs being put together, they're all held together, and somehow the whole structure is like each piece is supporting other pieces. There's no one piece that's like the base of the raft or the most foundational one. They all just are
Mm-hmm.
together, and they make each one sort of supports the other. Um, that's an analogy there for coherentistic sort of views.
So some type of like web, for lack of a better word, like a
Yep,
web
yep,
of beliefs where it's like they're all
yes,
supporting each other in some kind of way. Where my belief in A is in supporting my belief in P, and my belief in B is supported by C, and C supporting A, and kind of like in this like kind of web or chain, whatever. Um,
yeah. And we started when we started talking, we went back to like ancient philosophy and classical philosophy. There's a classical sort of trilemma. Actually, I don't know how many lemmas you want to put into it. Sextus Empiricus is one source for this, but yeah, roughly, he enumerated various views you might take, and one of them was sort of this view that you just sort of mentioned, that you might say you have this circle of beliefs or something like that, where your belief A is supported by belief B, which is supported by belief C, which is supported by belief D, which is supported by belief A, and you're back around again. Now that isn't really what a coherentist is going to say their view is, and most coherentist views don't support like straight up circular reasoning like that. Instead, they say you're thinking of it wrong when you think of justification as linear in that sense, as one thing having a basis on another, on another, on another. Instead, justification is in some way just a holistic thing. So it's not like beliefs are having circular support. It's just that like a belief's position in the system of beliefs is what makes for its justification. Uh,
and that makes sense.
yeah.
Where it's not like, yeah, it's a holistic thing. It's not like this linear thing that kind of classical foundationalism is kind of saying. But then you have people like I'm thinking of like Robert Audi,
Mhm.
to where he would say like, well, hold on, like when you actually, I think he used an example of like a TP, right? Well, at least like a TP, like it has a foundation, and you can still have it cohere, right? Because it goes to like a triangle, or like a cone, I guess, for that's how TPs are made. And then
Mhm.
like they cohere to a single point, but like yeah, there's a coherence to them, but there's also something that's supporting it, which is this foundation.
Yeah.
And so at least that's kind of somewhat of my view, where it's like, well, yeah, you can have both of those things to where it's not just one or the other. You have the foundation, but you also have like the coherence of part of it as well.
Yeah, so that's a very good point to make. A foundationalist is not committed to saying that coherence plays no role or something like that. The foundationalist view is essentially just that some beliefs trace back to something that justifies them, but itself does not require further justification. Um, there's also a view called Foundationalism. I don't know if you ever heard of that. Susan Hack is the philosopher most associated with that. Now, some people say that view is just foundationalism with coherence added in. We won't get into all the details there, but
Mhm.
um, she makes roughly something like that point too, which is just allowing some support from things that are not themselves needing justification doesn't rule out that coherence also plays a role.
Mhm.
Now, coherentists would want to rule out that there are things that by themselves are bases that justify
Mhm.
beliefs without coherence playing a role at all. They would deny that. There are different coherentist views, though, too. This is worth pointing out. Sometimes people think coherentism is just the view that only beliefs justify beliefs, and so it's just a matter of a coherent set of beliefs being in place. People will object to that view. They'll say, "Well, you could be isolated from the world completely." There's an isolation objection,
Mhm.
right? You could be just like I am right now, having this experience, but have a completely detached set of beliefs. Like your beliefs right now, let's say yours are all coherent. Well, now
Yeah.
let's take one of your listeners who's listening to this in the future, because they're not in front of a computer like we are. Well, maybe they are, but let's suppose they're not. They're listening on an iPad. So they're having a set of experiences right now and a set of beliefs as well. Suppose they have a totally coherent belief system, like, oh, I'm listening to a podcast right now, etc. If their belief system is coherent, I could have it right now while I'm sitting here and having these experiences. If it's just beliefs that matter, that seems kind of weird. It seems weird that I could be having these experiences, but believing I'm listening to a podcast right now and driving in my car. And
Mhm.
even though that belief system is coherent, the point there is something like experience has to play a role, some people think.
Mhm.
And the point I'm making here is you got to be careful because coherentists can accommodate that. Some of them do. There are these people who I suppose they would call themselves non-doxastic coherentists, not just beliefs, where experience plays a role as well, but the role it plays is not as a foundational justifier. It's just like one view, for example, is that experience is propositional in some way, and
Yeah.
so your beliefs have to cohere with the propositional contents of your experience um, as well. But they're not just justified directly and fully by experience. They also um, uh, have coherence with other beliefs as a factor in their justification. And
Yeah.
once you get to that point, it starts to get kind of hard sometimes to distinguish between uh, sort of foundationalist views that allow coherence and let coherence play a big role, and coherentist views that allow experience to play some role. They start to look pretty similar. Um, but
Yeah.
those
And
are distinctions to keep in mind. So,
yeah, and kind of like and kind of closing. There's a few things that go on in my mind where we started off ancient times, classical times, where knowledge was like these three conditions:
yeah,
justification, belief, and it had to be true. Then we went to these Gettier problems, and then post Gettier, it seems like the main focus has just been strictly on justification. At least those two kind of conditions, to where you have belief and justification, and that's kind of where it seems to be the main focus of kind of epistemology now. In my mind, and something we didn't really talk about, where it seems to be the case, at least pre Gettier, there was this either tacit or implicit kind of certainty we needed to have when it comes to our justified beliefs, because there is a movement such as, or maybe not a movement, but something such as like myself that are fallibilists, right? Where we can have beliefs that are justified, and yeah, we can be wrong about those things in principle, right? In
Mhm,
principle,
mhm,
I could, so I mean, in principle, I believe it's there's sun outside right here, but in principle, I could be wrong about that. But am I wrong? But am I really wrong? I guess in some way, like there's a relationship between like this certainty that maybe Gettier was um, wanting too much of, where we needed
mhm,
this certainty,
mhm,
where I think most philosophers now are kind of away from that, where we're like, well, we don't need certainty to have knowledge; we just need to have justified belief. Um, and in that way, and I would add personally, right, predictability.
mhm.
And that's like where my stance is personally. But anyway, kind of to see what you kind of have to say about that, or what you think about that, or yeah.
Well, yeah. So one way you could respond to the Gettier problem is by insisting that knowledge requires certainty, because these cases couldn't arise. One of Gettier's assumptions was that um, you could have justified false beliefs. So if that isn't the case, the Gettier it is one way, sort of, if you look at it this way, of solving the Gettier problem is to insist that knowledge requires certainty. The problem is, and you can get yourself to think that sometimes if you use the right wording. Like if you ask, "Do you really know?" Sometimes that really has an effect on you. And
Yeah.
but when you step back and think pre-theoretically, what things do I know? Well, I know my name is Jason, for example. A is the first letter of the alphabet. I could be wrong about that though. Once I start to think about it,
Hmm.
but nah, I know that's the case.
Hmm.
So yeah, that motivates a fallibilist view, and most people these days are fallibilists. That
Yeah.
is correct. So we said earlier, like you can't know something that's false. I don't want a listener to get confused and think that fallibilism says you can. It doesn't say you can know a thing that's
Hmm.
false. It just says you might have justification for a true belief. The belief, though, could be one that could be false given all you know.
Yeah.
Okay, we're not saying it actually is false, but something like um, you don't have absolutely certain justification for it.
Yeah, and that's something that I feel like the fallibilism, even though we didn't really touch a lot about it, kind of allows for. So it's like, okay, here's my justification. As a result of the justification, I believe this, given the current data. For example, like with COVID, right? This is the current data that's been given to us. This is how we reasonably act to this data. All right. Well, then we may not know the X, Y, and Z, but given the current data, this is what we're reasonably justified in believing, and this is how we're going to act in accordance to those beliefs. Yeah, we
Yeah,
could in principle be wrong about those things, and then but until new information arises, I mean, yeah, we can still be wrong about this, whatever. But that doesn't break kind of our epistemology, or at least that,
right.
in my mind, that like the epistemology that at least I hold to, like that wouldn't break it. It's just like, well, that's kind of built into it a little bit already.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And you know, COVID exists,
Yeah,
uh, right? But
yeah,
you could be wrong about that. There's a story I could tell where you're
yeah,
deceived or something like,
yeah,
right? But so yeah, that's a good thing to talk about and a good point to make. But sometimes people talk about justification, leave knowledge aside. Sometimes the thought is that Gettier cases, we got to make some kind of adjustment for it. We don't know quite what they are. It's less interesting, though. The thing that's really in our control is the justification part, and
mm,
that's the one that
mm,
we focus on more
yeah,
these days. I would say that's probably true, though there are certainly people who are still working on the Gettier stuff and still working on what knowledge is.
yeah,
Lots of other stuff we could have gone into tonight, but we've already gone quite some time, so
yeah, for sure.
I don't want to keep talking.
Yeah, no, for sure. And it definitely seems that in conversation to have people like they equate knowledge with certainty. And so, but
Mm,
anyway, that's a topic for another time about stuff.
mhm, mhm.
Jason, you've been more than generous with your time. I appreciate you coming on the podcast and talking to me about epistemology. And so, yeah, thank you for coming on.
Thanks. I hope I wasn't too overly generous, like offering too much. But yeah, it's hard to talk about all these things without making numerous distinctions, and I'm sure I tripped up somewhere. So, any listener who catches me, forgive me for that. But yeah, no, it's been great being on the show. Thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it. It's been fun to talk about this stuff, and I hope it helps a listener maybe get into this stuff a little more deeply if that's something they're interested in. I only scratched the surface of each view I talked about, so there's a lot more that could be said.
Yes, and I'm gonna put this right up front the screen. It's called Epistemology by
Oh yeah.
Feldman. It's a
Uh,
great introductory book. It was recommended to me by my philosophy teacher. Goes over a lot of what we've been talking about, but in
yep.
great more detail and a lot more sophistication behind it. So,
Yeah. If anything I said was not clear, you can probably find clarification in that book, and he'll say it better than I did. So, I definitely recommend it.
and that concludes another episode of the Reason Through podcast. See you next time. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Reason Through podcast, a show dedicated to having charitable, philosophical discussions, as well as helping you, the listener, develop and reason through your views. In this episode, I speak with Dr. Kevin Timpe. We speak on his work, Disability and Inclusive Communities. We speak with his experience on the educational system, on how it has impacted people that are disabled. We also speak about society, and we also speak about how we can do better and how we can move forward to a more inclusive society. Without further ado, I bring you Dr. Kevin Timpe. And that concludes another episode of the Reason Through podcast. If you find value in what I'm doing, please consider subscribing, rating, reviewing the podcast as it shows your support, and I would greatly appreciate it. See you next time.